Hello! In this video, we're going to talk about the hider spawn room of the museum. Alright, so if you recall, in the previous video, we talked about this tunnel, right? This is the tunnel that comes before hider spawn, right? Basically, you head in this direction, right? And so, you reach the hider spawn. And so really, we're talking about all the different hiding spots you can see in this room, right? Block piles, right? Chickens, right? These flower pots, and the tree. Now, once you enter the room, obviously, you might see like random blocks lying around, because obviously, since it's a hider spawn, many times you're going to find big hiders here. So it's important to know that. Like, for instance, if there's a hider right here, it's obviously AFK at hider spawn, hasn't moved ever since the game started. So obviously, you probably want to go kill it, right? Now, another thing that's really obvious is the tree, right? Right? The block piles may not be super obvious right now, but the tree is obvious, right? You obviously want to check the tree because many times you're going to find hiders on top of the tree, right? Many times, in almost every single game. Not every game, right? I'm telling you, not every game there actually are games where you don't find hiders on the tree, right? But many times you'll find them, and also most of the time they are non-ideal hiders, right? They'll be shooting at you and stuff, but they're usually not that hard to take care of, right? Most of them aren't that hard to take care of, right? Almost every single one you encounter isn't going to be that difficult. They're on the tree, right? And so notice how I'm shooting through these holes, right? Right? Those are like some things that you can use. Like if there's a hider right there, you shoot him, then you shoot him there, right? You can use those holes to your advantage to get double hits on them, right? And so this is basically it for the tree, right? Another thing to know about the tree is that there actually is a single real flower pot on the tree, which is over here at this branch. So you gotta know that flower pot right there is actually a real flower pot, right? So it's actually not a hider, right? Unless of course there's an investor there. All right, the next thing. Turns out there's a total of 4 flower pots underneath the tree, right? There's 4 flower pots, right? Turns out there are 4 flower pots here. So as you see, 1, 2, 3, 4. There are also 4 chickens in the room, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, right? And of course, as the game goes on, they tend to roam around a lot, so it gets a little bit more difficult to count them most of the time. So as I'm passing by, usually I just hit them, right? If they're sort of passing by me as I'm moving around, I'll just hit them to see whether or not they're fake or real. Right. Now that we've talked about that, now we gotta go over the block piles, right? Looks like there's quite a few, right? But they're all sort of near the boundary of the room, right? There are 2 ways that I categorize the block piles in this room, right? There are boundary block piles, right, such as the note block stack, which is basically touching the boundary of the room, and non-boundary block piles, which include this hay bale stack, which isn't touching the boundary of the room, right? It isn't along the boundary of the room. It's sort of away from it, like right here, right? Turns out there are 3 non-boundary block piles, right? Which is the hay bale stack, the furnace stack, and the melon stack. Those are the non-boundary block piles. And there are 4 boundary block piles, right? The note block stack is one of the boundary block piles, right? There's also the bookshelf stack over there, right? Again, along the boundary of the room, right? This note block stack, and the anvil stack over there, right? So, 3 non-boundary block piles, 4 boundary block piles. So, that's what we basically gotta know. The first thing we're gonna go over are the non-boundary block piles. So we're gonna start by going over the hay bales, the furnaces, and the melons. And starting with the hay bales, it might look intimidating at first, but it turns out all you gotta do is basically sort of know these spots, right? If you see a hay bale hiding right here, right? So something like that, you see basically it's directly touching 2 other hay bales, right? Those 2, as you can see. That would be fake, right? Or if you see a hay bale right here, right? 2 hay bales in a row like that is fake. Here, 2 hay bales in a row, fake. Again, as you can see, this hay bale is directly touching 2 other hay bales, just like what we saw before. This is a fake hay bale, right? Those are the most common spots in this hay bale stack. Literally, it's those ones, right? Another thing to notice is that there's only 1 hay bale on top of the stack. So if you see, for instance, 2 hay bales in a row like this, or like this, basically 2 hay bales on top of the stack, means you have a fake hay bale. Right? There should only be one, and also it shouldn't go too high up like this, right? This would be fake as well. And that's basically it for the hay bale stack, right? Pretty easy. You don't have to worry about the ones that like aren't part of the stack, right? Usually you aren't going to actually see a hay bale like this, right? It's actually really uncommon. Eventually, as you play the game more and more, you'll get used to stuff like that, but it's basically not something you have to worry about too much, right? Radar could take care of it later on. But next, we're moving on to the furnace stack. The furnace stack is actually also really easy as well. And the reason why is because notice how if there's a hider here, for instance right here, it's directly touching another furnace on the same level, right? For instance right here, this furnace that I'm hiding as is directly in touch with this furnace on the same level, right? If there's a furnace right here, right, it's directly touching two other furnaces on the same level, right? That one and that one, right? 3 furnaces in a row. Same thing happens right here, right? Directly touching 2 other furnaces on the same level, right? So something like that is what you got to look for, right? That same thing happens if there's a furnace right here, right? Again, directly in line with this furnace right here, right? Directly touching this furnace right there. And same thing near the edge of the map, right? It's directly touching 2 other furnaces, right? That one and that one, right? Directly touching 2 other furnaces, right? So that's really the whole idea, right? Again, you actually even sometimes see this spot right here, again, directly touching another furnace. This is actually usually what you're going to see for the furnace stack, right? You usually aren't going to see like a furnace out here like this, right? Furnaces typically don't hide like this. They like to hide actually physically in the stack, right? Again, something like this. You usually don't see this, right? Turns out, so you don't have to worry about it too much, right? Or diagonal furnaces like that. You don't usually see it, right? Usually they like to actually hide by directly touching other furnaces on the same level like this. So something like that. Because there aren't any furnaces here that are directly touching another furnace on the same level, right? So if you see that, they have to be a hider, right? Again, something like this. It's directly touching 2 other furnaces on the same level, which makes it a fake furnace. Some other spots you might see is if it's like 2 furnaces on top of each other in this spot right here. Right, that same thing might happen right here. So if you see something like that, it's fake. Right? Also, if you see it sort of blocking this pathway right here, that's fake. The other thing you might see is if you have a furnace leaning up against the edge of the map, like basically it's surrounded by 3 stone blocks, right? And this would be a fake furnace. The same thing happens over here, actually. Or if there's a furnace right here, that's also fake, right? That's basically it for the furnaces. As you can see, actually it's not super bad. Our last non-boundary block pile is the melon stack, right? As for the melon stack, right, this is probably the most common spot in the melon stack, is to find one behind the stack like that, right? Some other parts is if you see a square of melons like this, right? You see a melon right here, it's fake, right? Or if you see 2 melons in a row on this side of the stack, right? That's fake as well. You don't have to worry about the melons surrounding the stack so much, because it's sort of like the hay bale stack, where you have hay bales surrounding the central hay bale, right? We have hay bales, individual hay bales, surrounding the central part of the stack right here. And the same thing happens in the melon stack, right? We have individual melon blocks surrounding the central structure, but you don't have to worry about them too much. Usually you aren't going to find melons that hide like this, right? Because ideal hiders don't naturally like to hide out in the open like this. It makes them feel vulnerable naturally, so that's the reason why you typically won't see that. But you will sometimes see a melon hide in this same exact manner as we saw for the furnaces, where they're surrounded by 3 stone blocks. You might even see 2 melons in a row in this slot right here, right? So this is basically it for the melon stack, right? So that's basically it for all the non-boundary block piles. Next, we're going to be talking about the boundary block piles, which again includes the note block stack, the bookshelf stack, that note block stack, and the anvil stack. Before we go in depth about the note block stack, there's actually a common feature among all of the boundary block piles, which is basically the fact that there are two gaps in each of the stack, right? There's a gap here and a gap here. That same thing happens in the bookshelf boundary block pile, where there's two gaps in the stack, right? There's a gap there and a gap there. Right, same thing goes on right here with these note blocks. You have two gaps, right? A gap there and a gap there. Right, same thing for the anvils. There's also two gaps, right? There's a gap there and a gap there. So that same exact thing happens for all of those block piles, right? So now let's, actually there's one other thing that's common among all of them, right? You have, not all of them, but I believe it's three of them. You actually have this specific set of blocks that look like this, right? It turns out that same exact structure occurred in one of the first videos we did on the museum, right? It happened with the TNTs over here, where you have that same exact structure, it's just flipped around, right? You have that same exact structure in this TNT stack, it's just flipped around. So if we quickly go back to where we were before, right, you have that same exact thing happening in three of the boundary block piles, right? One for the note block stack, right? The other is the bookshelf stack over here, right? That same exact structure. And then actually it occurs in the anvil stack, right over here, right here. And so that is all the different similarities between the boundary block piles, which are really interesting. So I would definitely be familiar with those, so it can help you memorize it a little better. So now let's go into the specifics of the boundary block piles, right? Again, two gaps, one there and one there. If you see it filled, right, for this gap, this note block would be fake, and for the other gap, this note block would be fake. Some other interesting patterns you might see is this spot right here. Like, for instance, if you see 2, 3, 2 with these note blocks, that would be a fake. Right? If you see it go 2, 2, 2, that would be a fake note block. If you see it go 3, 3 like that, that would be fake. Right? Note block should never go 4 blocks high, so that would be fake as well. Right? If you see any modification to this structure, as we were sort of talking about in the previous video, like this, right? Any one of those modifications would be fake, right? So stuff like that would make it a fake note block, right? And also for this lone note block over here, you should never see two note blocks on top of each other or two note blocks in a row, right? And last but not least, right, you don't want to see note blocks that are sort of squaring off the structure, like in one of those two spots, right? Every single note block, right, is touching the boundary of the map, right? So if you see a note block right here, it's not directly touching the boundary of the map, right? So it has to be a fake note block. So that's basically it for the note block stack over here. Now we move on to the bookshelf stack. As for the bookshelf stack, again, two gaps, right? One there and one there. So if you see a bookshelf in this gap, it looks like this, it's fake. Bookshelf in this gap, it's also fake. Again, any modification to this structure that we're seeing, like for instance, like this, right? Square bookshelves, bookshelf on top, that. Or I guess if it's squared off like this, that would be fake. Right? As for the diagonal staircase, right, it goes 3, 2, 1. Well, if it ever goes 3, 2, 2, that would be fake. 3, 3, 1 is fake. Right? Or if you have 4, 2, 1, right, if it goes way too high up like that, it's also fake. For the two bookshelves here, you should never see it go like a bookshelf right next to it like that. Right? And you also shouldn't see 3 bookshelves on top of each other like this. Right? And just like in the note block stack, every single bookshelf that's here should be touching, right, directly touching the boundary of the map. So if you see a bookshelf like this, it's not directly touching the boundary of the map, so these would be fake. Right? That's basically it for the bookshelf stack. As for the note block stack, right, again, they should never be in one of those two gaps, right? For instance, there's a note block right here, it's fake. Right, a note block right here, it's fake. Right? And that's the idea. Right? Some other things, right? If we look at this central part of it, right, you should never see a note block right here. Right? Goes 3, 1, 3, 1, 3, that would be fake. It should go 3, 1, 2, 1, 3, right? you should never actually see the bookshelf step go 3, the note block stack go 3, 3 as well. Right? You should also never see 2, 2 like that, or 2, 2 like this. So something like that would be fake, right? You should also never see 3 note blocks on top of each other right here. And so that is basically it for the note block stack, right? Lastly, we have the anvil stack. Right? This is the last block pile. Right, again, 2 gaps. Right, for instance, like this. Right, but this one was probably slightly more common to see a note block anvil right here. Right, you also shouldn't see an anvil blocking the pathway into this tunnel, right? Should never see an anvil blocking that pathway like this. That would be fake. Notice how on the left side of the stack we have 2 block staircase, right? 2 block staircase, 2 block staircase. Right? Notice how overall there's 1 anvil on the top of the stack. So if you see 2 anvils on top of the stack like this, that would be fake. Right? You shouldn't see the anvil stack squared off like this or like this. Right? That would be fake. Right? You also shouldn't see any modification to this part of the structure. Right? For instance, a square of anvils, 3 anvils high up. Oops. 2 anvils in a row, squared off, right? Stuff like that. You just don't want to see that modified. And that's basically it for all the block piles in this game. I guess I should mention some of the flower pot spots. So if you see a flower pot next to this one, it's fake. Right? Flower pot on the other side like this. Right? Or 2 flower pots in a row under here. That would be fake. You also shouldn't see a flower pot that goes a little high up, like up to here. Something like that is fake as well. And another thing before this video ends, right? We do have some other spots you might see. For instance, like an anvil or a furnace or a flower pot, like between these stone blocks, right? So like right here or right here, right? There's also one of those over here. I already mentioned the one with the melon, right? This one's anvil, but right, if you recall, I mentioned the one with the melon over here. Right, again, the same thing can happen over here. So basically, you got to be aware of possibly seeing things like that. And lastly, each boundary block pile actually is surrounded by 2 anvils. So 1, 2. Same thing for the bookshelves. 1, 2. Right, but it does actually have an extra anvil. Lastly, for the note block pile, 1, 2 anvils surrounding it. So this is basically it for the hider spawn room of the museum.